everyone, and welcome to the College Chats podcast. On our last episode, we talked a little about some of the huge changes happening in college football. So, for this episode, we thought we'd best get an expert to help us understand it all. But before we get to our expert, we're the College Chaps. I'm George, and I'm joined by Oliver, who is also an expert. I'm not going to be disingenuous. Ollie, how are you, my friend?
I was going to say, George, that is without doubt the most polite introduction you've ever done for me. I don't think you've ever said anything quite so kind. This is the nicest thing anyone said to me today, to be honest.
I likened you to Ant Deck last week, I think, if I remember rightly. I thought that was
Yes.
relatively kind. Um, our guest makes his third appearance on this podcast, and what a step down it is from being on the beach with Greg Sankey and Paul Feinbaum last week in Florida. So it's a warm welcome back to Yahoo Sports senior college football writer Ross Dellenger. Hi, Ross. Welcome back. How are you?
Hey George, good to be on.
It's good to see you, and we do appreciate you hustling to get in to speak to us. So let's get into it, Ross. We know that you are in the middle of a lot of this stuff, and I wanted to touch, before we get on to what happened in Destin last week, I wanted to touch a little bit on the house settlement because this is something that everybody thought was going to come through in April, and then it was pushed to June, and now it's been extended, I believe, to the 27th of June, which is awfully close to the 1st of July. What I've got a question, but what's your sense about where this is all heading? And I guess my doomsday question is, well, what happens if it's not all signed and delivered on the 27th of June? Because that leaves schools in a bit of a predicament.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking that it's June 3rd, almost exactly 2 months since the final hearing held in Oakland that I attended. I don't think anybody thought that it would be this long, that it would be this extended. I think most people thought certainly by the end of April that she would rule, but she had one issue with the settlement, the roster limits that the settlement imposes on teams, and basically it would lead to the elimination of over 5,000 and as much as probably 15,000 roster spots, and athletes would be cut and have been cut because of it. And she kind of targeted that section as being an issue. And so, without going into detail of each filing, it's been basically 2 months or so of back and forth between the judge and the plaintiff attorneys and defendants, the NCAA and the power conferences, and the athletes that are suing. It's been kind of a back and forth on how to handle this roster situation. And the latest filing was about a little over 2 weeks ago, where the NCAA and the power conferences filed a response to these group of people that are objecting to the settlement on the grounds of the roster limits. And so it's kind of been in the judge's hands now for a little over 2 weeks. And the power conferences and the NCAA have decided to grandfather in players who are currently on rosters. That way they're not cut. The problem is a lot of them have already been cut. And the other problem is it's it's optional for schools to grandfather, so it's not mandatory. So there's a question whether that the judge will take exception to that. But it's been in her hands for a couple weeks now, and kind of mostly radio silence. You mentioned the June 27th. So there's a little bit of confusion. This week, Wednesday, so June 4th, I believe, was supposed to be the deadline for each of the parties to file. I think it's called summary judgment. I get the lingo, attorney lingo, a little confused sometimes, but it's basically the start of going to court for this case. And so she just extended that deadline about 3 weeks, which you know you would think that she'll rule by that deadline, since that's the deadline that the parties have to file now. But I think a lot of people thought she would rule by this deadline of June 5th, and she hadn't, or June 4th, and she hadn't. So yeah, we're just kind of in a state of waiting.
And am I correct in saying that, well, from 1 July, schools should be paying athletes at that moment in time? So what happens if there isn't a ruling? Because that kind of throws things into a little bit of chaos in that respect, isn't it? Because some schools will take a decision to do it, and some schools perhaps will decide not to do it. And as you say, rosters have already been, manipulated, cut in that respect. So what happens if we don't have a decision by June 27th?
Yeah, there are a lot of problems with the settlement. There are a lot of issues that will be exposed. It's not a complete solution, obviously, but it is probably the better alternative than not having a settlement at all. And
Mhm.
so if it is denied, I hate to use the word cataclysmic, but um, it could be that. I think you'll have some schools, like you mentioned, begin to share revenue directly with athletes under a system without a cap, completely unregulated, probably no enforcement entity or no clearinghouse for third-party booster deals. It would just be a completely unregulated market, similar to now, but schools will be directly paying athletes. I think some schools will have the advantage because their state law allows them to do certain things that other schools in other states can't do. I think you'll probably have the NCAA begin the process of changing rules to allow schools to do certain things like sharing revenue, like expanding scholarships as the settlement does. You'll probably have some of those things have to be changed. And the settlement kind of binds the power conferences to the NCAA through the duration of the settlement, which was 10 years, because the NCAA, in its lower level schools outside of the power conferences, are helping pay the tab, basically. They're helping pay the back damages, so it binds everybody together. So that is a separate conversation, but if the settlement's not approved, that bind doesn't exist. And there's probably a really good chance that you'll have the power conferences break away and probably begin setting their own regulation and rules in a separate governing entity.
And I guess, in law, you should never assume anything, but if there were real issues with this um, settlement bill, then you would like to think that the judge would have predicated any kind of outcome, any negative outcome by this point. And as you say, there has been some toing and froing on it. So it would be remarkable if there was a cliff edge come the 27th of June. That doesn't feel intuitively where this should end up.
Yeah, I think that most people in college athletics believe that she will approve it and that she's taken a while to either number one, write in order that stands up to an appeal, and she's making sure that the objectors kind of know that they've been heard, and she's given them time, thoughtful kind of time to think about their objections. So that's kind of like the going theory. But there are certainly plenty of people, some in college athletics, but many of them outside of college athletics, that believe she's writing a denial order. And that's why it's taking a while because she's denying the settlement and needs to come up with reasons why. Still would be, I think that would be a surprise to a lot of folks. But, there's a lot of speculation on why she's taken so long and how she'll rule. And really, and I get asked every day, maybe two, three, four times a day, when's the settlement coming down? When's the ruling coming down? And there really is only one person in the world that knows when it's coming down potentially and how it will be ruled on, and that is her and maybe a clerk or two in her office, but probably not even that. It's probably just her. And as much as I've reported on the settlement, I don't text with the judge, so she's not letting me in on any scoop.
How, how disappointing, Ross.
The House settlement appears to be more locked down than the NFL draft is because you can find out days in advance who's getting selected away in the NFL draft these days. That is obviously the House settlement has been a major off-field topic of conversation throughout the off-season and beyond, really. But obviously, you've been at the SEC spring meetings where there's also been a lot of focus on what we're going to see on the field in the postseason, not just this season, but for the future of the college football playoff as well. The SEC spring meetings are usually a good barometer for the mood of how those decisions ultimately will pan out. What's the feeling with the future of the college football playoff, Ross, off the back of those meetings? Is the SEC, as it has done for a while, still favouring a 5+11 format? Is there a wind of change that's blowing through that conversation?
Yeah, it's kind of like the House settlement. It's very uncertain right now, the future of the playoff format. You know, right now, playoff format is 12 teams. You have seven at large and five spots for conference champions. The four power conference champions, and then one from the group of six conferences. And the SEC and Big Ten have authority on a future format. It was granted to them by the other conferences last spring in order to keep them in the CFP and keep them from breaking away. Actually, they threatened to break away, and part of the deal was to give them more money and distribution, which they did, and grant them the right to control future access and format. So they've been meeting together a few times over the last year, the SEC and Big Ten, and came, especially for the Big Ten side, came to an agreement that they were going to change the format to a 16-team format that grants four automatic qualifiers each to SEC and Big Ten, and two each to the ACC and Big 12, and one group of six champion, and then three at large. That was proposed by the Big Ten originally, and it was made clear that the SEC was as well in support of that format over the last several weeks in CFP meetings. That got a lot of pushback from the Big 12 and ACC, from Notre Dame, from politicians in Congress, even from ESPN as well. Enough pushback that last week the league decided against that, to the surprise of many in the Big Ten. And kind of the last straw was that the SEC head football coaches came out publicly against it, actually, while they were at their meetings, despite athletic directors being fairly overwhelmingly for it. So it was kind of a curveball thrown last week, and I think I think the pushback from coaches was sort of a last straw. When you look at all the other pushback that this was receiving, and so now the SEC more so back to a model that is more at larges, whether that's 5'11", that's what they specifically focused on last week, or 5'9", with 5 AQs and then 11 at large, or 5 AQs and 9 at large, or the current version, 5 AQs and 7 at large. I think that that's an issue for the Big Ten. They wanted multiple AQs, and not only that, but the SEC plays one fewer conference game, which in a way is one fewer loss than the Big Ten. The Big Ten plays 9, the SEC plays 8, And when you're looking at large selections and bids into the playoff, the selection committee looks a lot at losses. So they're kind of at an impasse. They're kind of at a stalemate a little bit. Um, I think they would move to a 5-11 if the SEC and the ACC moved to 9 conference games, which is where the Big Ten and Big 12 are. They're both at 8 instead right now, like I mentioned earlier. And but I don't know that they can get there. I don't know that the SEC, which has been pushing back on going to 9 conference football games for a while, I don't know if they can get to that point. Everybody kind of thought they were there, but last week changed a lot of that because when you're not guaranteed certain playoff spots, I think there's a resistance to add another potential loss for half of your league if you're adding another conference game. So it is sort of a stalemate right now. And from what I'm led to believe is that the Big Ten and SEC both need to agree on a format for a format to be adopted.
There was
Oh, sorry, George.
no. All I was going to say was it struck me, and I'm clearly 3,500 miles away, Ross, that listening to some of the head coaches on TV, there was a clear message to the playoff committee about strength of schedule versus the wins columns, and that to me was playing very much into the 9 game schedule, right? Which I think is just really what you said, which is the SEC not willing to move into that 9 game SEC conference schedule without really understanding how the College Football Playoff Committee is going to view that extra game. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think so. And that was a big topic last week at SEC meetings was the selection committee criteria um, and what they look at. There was a lot of talk from coaches and ADs about the right hand column, which is the loss column, um, in how the selection committee examines looks at that right hand column too much and not the strength of schedule enough. And I think that I think that if you look at the selection committee, there's in the criteria they use to select the teams, there's going to be changes made in the Big Ten and SEC. Not only do they control format, but they control the selection committee. They control the selection committee criteria, who's on the committee, how the committee works, all that stuff. So I think uh, I think you'll see the criteria change to skew more toward the selection committee considering more of strength of schedule and conference strength of schedule as well. And I don't know how they'll do that. I don't know what kind of barometer they'll use, but I think that that's where it feels like it's headed.
Ross, you just going back to something you said before, you talked about an impasse between the Big Ten and the SEC, and obviously there has been this alliance between those two conferences for quite a while now. And obviously this conversation about their influence over the college football playoff format going forward was designed to stop them from breaking away together. Now, I guess I've got a bit of a two-part question. If the two conferences are at an impasse over the college football playoff format and what it means, these different formats for each conference, um, how big of an issue is that, the impasse itself? And then if those two conferences are at loggerheads, how does that play into the threat of a breakaway? If the two conferences aren't in cahoots as much, if they don't agree on certain things, surely that chance of a breakaway between the two is kind of a little nullified to a degree.
It is. I think I think the biggest thing that happened that is going to come out of last week at SEC meetings is the impact that this sort of curveball reversal, whatever you want to call it, has on the relationship between the two giants of college athletics, and their athletic directors have met jointly twice in the last 7 8 months or so. Their two commissioners, um, they talk often, they meet often. Um, so I think that when you look at some of the things that the SEC and Big Ten were looking at doing, um, now all of a sudden, whether that's this playoff format or some kind of scheduling agreement between the two or eventual breakaway, it does feel like that's been put on sort of pause. It feels like been impacted by what happened last week. I think that the Big Ten administrators were pretty shocked, you know, um, and so I don't know where that leaves them in their relationship with the SEC.
Do you think I'm trying to phrase this appropriately? Do you think there's an inevitability about the SEC moving to a nine-game conference schedule, i.e., they will get to it at some point, or do you legitimately think, from what the head coaches and the ADs are talking about just now, that there's a real reluctance to move to that at this stage?
Yeah, there's been a reluctance now for a long time, going on probably 5 years, for the SEC to move to a 9 game conference schedule. And part of that reluctance has been, you know, the again the impact that a extra loss on half of the league would have on playoff chances. But also the SEC has wanted more money um, from ESPN to play an extra game. And so I think that's also kind of at play. How much money is ESPN going to really offer? Um, and we know it's probably about $5 million per school per year, is what they're talking about. That's the discussions. It's kind of what the number is, I think. But I don't know if it's enough, especially in a format where you have multiple AQs, or where you don't have multiple AQs for one league. I think you're looking at it's hard because Greg Sankey has been in favor of 9 games pretty clearly for a while now, and um, he just hasn't been able to move the room that way. For this has been a topic of discussion for at least 4 years or so. So it could be one of these things where if they don't do this multiple AQ, this 4-4-2-2-1 that I mentioned earlier, and they don't do it partly because the coaches didn't want to do it because they think they can get more teams in, and for other reasons, as I mentioned earlier, just the political pushback in general. Then if you move to a 5-11, then it seems only right to then you know play the same amount of conference games as other leagues. But it's been a hard thing to push across the finish line for Greg Sankey, and they've only got about 2 more months to do it. They need to know by August if they're going to do 8 or 9 games next year. So they'll probably have to make that decision before they make a decision on the future of the college football playoff format in 2026 and beyond. And that leaves you with a real difficult kind of issue there. And I'm not sure, where it goes from here.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because these are all pieces of the same jigsaw puzzle that have to, everything we've talked about today is all part of the, they all have a knock-on impact on the next decision. And just as you said there, it's almost impossible for the SEC to make that decision on what their schedules look like without understanding what the college football playoff. But then that all has kind of repercussions for many other aspects of the. But from the outside looking in, it's pretty fascinating. I'm sure for the college football administrators, it's a real pain in the neck. But
It
it's
is. It is. It's and then when you throw it in with everything else that's going on, um, it really it becomes just another thing on everybody's plate, sort of thing to sift through.
Let's talk about. We started off talking about the house settlement and obviously the financial implications of that. One thing that has been, well, we haven't touched on this podcast yet, but the conversation that isn't going away is private equity. The
Mm.
ACC and Big 12 seem to have ruled out private equity involvement at this stage, but I'd say this a short term um, issue of not looking at private equity, or is it sort of a long term likelihood that the ACC and Big 12 kind of shy away from that?
Yeah, certainly at some point, some school or conference is gonna strike a deal with private equity. There's too much money needed in this rev share era for schools and conferences not to take the dive down this private equity or even private capital, more of like a loan type. Big 12 and Big 10 as conferences have looked into it probably deeper than any. It got to the Big 12 for a vote and was basically voted down. Not that in the conversation will continue, but um, so and plenty of schools have looked into it, and many of them are still looking into it very seriously. So I think at some point you will have somebody um, somebody will do this. I don't know if it's a real popular thing among fans and certainly um, certain commissioners and college athletic officials. It's probably not a real popular thing. And that's kept a lot of people, I think, from doing it. Uh, there's a lot of schools that have donors who own banks and other companies that they can borrow money from for 1 or 2%, not 10% plus, like a lot of the private equity and private capital is. So I think many of them have gone down that road instead. Um, but I do think we're going to see it at some point. In a separate conversation, the private equity backed kind of super league proposals that have been bantered about a little bit that kind of emulate actually over in Europe, the Premier League, some of those type of models. They're still kicking around. At least one of them is still kind of kicking around too, and has smash capital. It's called Project Rudy, and it's a $9 billion private equity backed um, sort of idea. And they've held serious conversations with the Big 12, the ACC, and a lot of the Group of Six conferences and leaders at those levels. But the SEC and Big Ten has been hesitant to do anything with them or even speak to them really in a formal manner. So I don't know where they go from here, but they're still very active.
I hope they stay as far away as possible. For someone who's spent a career dealing with private equity, it scares the bejesus out of me that they're hovering around college football. And that's all the time we have for on this episode with Ross, and really do appreciate you. I know you literally ran in the door to have a chat with us. Um, you've been writing quite a bit about what you've just been talking about, Ross. But for those listeners who don't know where to find you, where can they find you, and what have you got in the works that we can all watch out for in the coming weeks?
Yeah, well, there's plenty of things happening. The college football playoff stuff will continue to be a conversation point. And obviously, at some point, we will get the House settlement ruling. And I can't imagine it again going past this week, but I didn't think it would go this far. So you have that happening, and then there's the NCAA governance conversation, where how the NCAA governs itself and the role of the NCAA in the future as well. So you have a lot of these big picture stories that will unfold probably over the summer and into the fall, and everything's just waiting kind of on the first domino to drop with the settlement and the ruling there, and that will kind of set off a series of events with all this stuff.
I think you're still in DC, so you're in the right part of the world to keep on top of all that's happening. We do appreciate you coming along to chat to us. That's all from us on this episode. Thanks to Ross and Ollie for their excellent input, and thanks to you for listening and supporting us. Stay safe and well, and catch you all next time.